To you, Madiba, we say, job well done. God bless you.
I thank the gentle lady from the great state of Ohio. And obviously, when Nelson Mandela looked at the United States, one of the things that he was most interested in was the civil rights struggle in this country, understanding that African Americans who were fighting for the right to vote and for equal justice under the law, we were in a significant minority position demographically, whereas in South Africa, black South Africans were the overwhelming majority in that country. And he was quite taken that the United States could right itself in such a way, at least legally, against the laws that oppress minorities here in our country, African Americans in particular. He always was interested in this. One of the persons who was uniquely involved in that and who serves with us in this House today, I want to recognize now to speak for 2.5 minutes, is Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton.
I thank my good friend from Philadelphia, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, who is so honorably following the great example of his predecessor, Bill Gray, and leading us today in the House and all of the work he's done in the House.
Thank you.
I want to thank the Congressional Black Caucus, and particularly our chairman, Marcia Fudge, who led us on an exhausting but exhilarating trip to South Africa just this week. I want to thank the CBC. Before I ever thought about coming to Congress, for decades of work which was instrumental in the release and the work of Nelson Mandela. When I went to South Africa this week, I wanted to share with South Africans their farewell to the father of their country, to Madiba, the man who meant so much to millions of us for his leadership throughout the world. And I went because for me he was a freedom-defining leader. I knew Nelson Mandela before I met him. As a member of the Free South Africa movement that was particularly active and began here in the District of Columbia, the organization led by Trans-Africa, the movement led by Trans-Africa, which became synonymous with Free Mandela. Mr. Speaker, it was almost 30 years ago that 4 of us went into the South African embassy. Randall Robinson, the head of Trans-Africa, Dr. Mary Berry, my own predecessor, former Congressman Walter Fauntleroy, and I, who secured an appointment with the ambassador to South Africa, I must say under false pretenses because we didn't intend to come out. However, in those first arrests, we could not have imagined the cascade of events that followed. We really did not imagine that from all over the country protests would come and people would come to be arrested to free Mandela. Mr. Speaker, perhaps least of all did I imagine that on his 95th birthday we would have a commemoration where the Democratic and the Republican leaders of this House would gather to celebrate Mandela's 95th birthday. If you can't imagine the life of Nelson Mandela, there's so much about that life that was unimaginable. And there's so many to thank tonight, because as I think about all of those who people see who are connected with Mandela, because there are millions of them, I hope we do not forget those who led this movement, that we do not forget Bill Gray, who was a sponsor of the sanctions bill and succeeded in overriding a veto to get it through the Congress of the United States. I hope we do not forget Trans-Africa, which invented the struggle for freedom for Mandela, or Ron Dellums, or former Senator Mike Lugar, who were sponsors of the bill. I hope we do not forget the hundreds of thousands who lobbied and picketed their state legislatures to divest pension funds from South Africa. It is very difficult to imagine that without that collective action, Mandela would have been free to free his country. Most of all, Mr. Speaker, tonight we thank Nelson Mandela himself. How do you thank a man for making the highest and best use of his best years, by spending them almost 30 years incarcerated, and then coming out to peacefully and ever so gently lead his fellow South Africans to lay down their grievances. Just as Martin Luther King said, lay down your arms, lay down their grievances, rise above their painful scars, their own years of suffering, and to somehow march with him into a new multiracial South Africa. It's a South Africa which today, like Madiba, its great leader, is an example for the rest of the world. Much of the rest of the world today, I hope, remembers Madiba not only for what his years of sacrifice meant, but for how he used those years to bring peace in the last place where peace was expected. I thank the gentleman for leading us tonight.
I thank the gentlewoman for her extraordinary contributions to this remarkable occurrence in our lifetime, to see Mandela and his transformation from prisoner to president. I'll have something more to say about that as we close, but I want to recognize the gentlelady from the great state of New York, our new ambassador to South Africa, Patrick Gaspar. Hails from the community of New York and is doing an extraordinary job. I want to recognize Congresswoman Yvette Clarke, who has the best birthday in the world, because she shares it with me. Yvette Clarke, yes. 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank Congressman Fattah for leading us in this special order in commemoration of Madiba. I stand today to honor the memory of President Nelson Mandela of South Africa, a world leader of the highest order, an icon. His commitment to justice, equality, and the right to human dignity that must be afforded each individual person accorded him a moral authority that just could not be denied. Nelson Mandela, affectionately known as Madiba, understood that the policy of apartheid was pure evil, a violation of our shared commitment to human rights and to the dignity of each individual. Trained as an attorney, he became an activist, and for his activism, he was imprisoned in the very year that I was born, confined to a cell on Robben Island. Through activism, he affirmed the ability of women and men to achieve freedom from the harshest forms of racial oppression, created a movement that inspired people worldwide. I myself was inspired as a young person by his example as a student on the campus of Oberlin College, where, like many campuses across this nation, led a divestment movement. I was in the enormous crowd of people in Brooklyn who cheered President Mandela upon his release from Robben Island. I remember the electricity in the air. Who could forget the experience of cheering a man who had come to our shores, arrived in the very district that I represent today, and who transformed his nation and the whole world in saying the words, "Free Nelson Mandela." Mr. Speaker, I was honored and humbled to be a part of the congressional delegation that attended his memorial earlier this week, to pay my respects and that of my constituents in the 9th Congressional District. Nelson Mandela will remain forever an inspiration to those who believe in justice and equality and the promise of a better future for all of God's children. Today, Madiba is truly free. We all mourn in tribute to a hero, to men and women everywhere. I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentlelady, and I thank not just you, but all those who hail from your part of the country who helped in this struggle. I want to recognize the congressman from the city of Newark in the state of New Jersey, Congressman Donald Payne, Jr., who will be allotted 2.5 minutes to speak on the life and legacy of President Nelson Mandela.
Mr. Speaker, Nelson Mandela, as we know, was a hero for social justice and a model of leadership in this globe. Born during the years of apartheid, he was resilient as a democratic leader, a peacemaker, and inspiring fighter for racial equality. As it has been stated and well-known fact that Mr. Mandela spent 27 years in prison. Well, let's look at that time in a little more detail. Jailed as a young man with 2 young children, one of them only being 3 years old, not being able to touch her again for 27 years. While in prison, his mother passes away, his firstborn son dies in a tragic car accident, never being able to say goodbye. Also, during that time, his wife was subjected to abuse, both physical and mental. And she was locked up in prison for 16 months in solitary confinement. So how does a person, after all of that strife and all of that grief, come out of prison and talk about reconciliation? President Mandela never let his 27 years in prison deter him from doing what he knew was right by ending apartheid and bringing democracy to the country that he loved. Even in the face of extreme adversity, he has proven that with a noble cause and an eternal will, one person can change the tide of oppression. One person can change an entire country, and in turn, the entire world. Although I did not have the pleasure of meeting President Mandela, he has always been a role model to me, and likewise was an inspiration to my father, the late Congressman Donald Payne, who toiled on the continent of Africa for equal rights and humanity for all people, and especially in South Africa. So I am thankless for his tireless years of service and for being an example of true leadership. My condolences and prayers go out to the Mandela family and to the country of South Africa as the entire world mourns such a great loss. Although Madiba is gone, his work and the imprint he has made on this world will never be forgotten. And I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. And now let me recognize the Democratic leader in the House of Representatives, Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fattah, for taking this special order as part of the Congressional Black Caucus period of mourning for President Mandela. I was so proud that so many members from the CBC and Mr. McDermott and others went to South Africa to be present at the celebration of the life and, of course, the memorial services for President Mandela. I wish that I could have gone. In fact, I thought I was, and so did Mr. Van Hollen and Mr. Clyburn, but the business of the budget kept us here. But our thoughts and prayers were with all of you as we were at the National Cathedral yesterday. What I came to the floor to say is, of course, to associate myself with all the beautiful sentiments expressed by my colleagues about an icon in the world, a person that is so unique in history, not just in our lifetimes, but in the history of the world. And when I was asked today some thoughts about President Mandela, I said what he did reminded me of King Solomon. When King Solomon was to inherit the kingdom, the throne from his father David, King David, he prayed to God with a great spirit of humility. And the humility he said to God, God, please give me the wisdom to be the president, to be the king of your people, to follow in the footsteps of King David. Please give me wisdom and understanding so that I can do the job. And God came back to him another night and said, Solomon, because you did not ask for longevity, vengeance upon your enemies, or great wealth, I will give you more wisdom and more understanding than any other person has ever had. And people will come from all around, and your wisdom will be renowned in the world for ages to come. It reminds me so much of Nelson Mandela because in his greatness was that spirit of humility, that humility that was open to wisdom, to understanding, being in somebody else's place, that led him not to wish for long life, though God gave him that, not to give him great wealth, which he did not possess, certainly not to give him vengeance upon his enemies, because that was the opposite of what he was. In the spirit of forgiveness, as our colleagues have discussed, and reconciliation, he, in the great wisdom that God gave him, as well as the long life, was able to use that wisdom, springing from that humility, to understand other person's situation, and then, of course, to do great things. Things that would make him renowned for ages to come, for his wisdom and for his spirit. I had the privilege of seeing President Mandela when he came to address a joint session of Congress in 1994 as the President of South Africa. Afterward, Speaker Foley, had a luncheon, and he invited a number of us to have lunch with President Mandela, a large number of us. And President Mandela spoke again at that luncheon. And what was sad about it is that he spoke about the price he paid to be the father of his country and what expense that came to being the father of his family. He talked about how it was to be separated from your family for over 26 years. Imagine, from his wife, from his children, meeting their needs and the rest. And also his needs to be a father. He made quite a sacrifice. It was urgent that he do so, but again, in every different periods of his life, he demonstrated great courage, great determination, great strength, great persistence in prison, great sadness about not seeing his family, and all of that strengthened him to say he really had to exploit the investment that had been made by the people of South Africa in the name Mandela. And when he came out to be an example to the world of forgiveness, of reconciliation, of a strength unlike most of us have ever seen. As a Californian, I have to say we take some ownership of the Mandela whole issue, with whether it was stopping investments in South Africa and the rest. Ron Dellums was a champion of this, and so we're proud of the role that we played in from the great state of California. But it really is, again, in that same humility that is a virtue that we should all possess, that I come to this floor to even talk about such a great, who went from a village to a leader of a movement, to prison, to the presidency of South Africa. from a name that we heard in America to a person who would address the Joint Chiefs, a joint session of Congress. Joint Chiefs were here too. But on top of all of that, to go from his village to be a world icon. Thank you, my colleague, for giving me the time to say some words.
Madam Leader, for coming and sharing with us profound reflections on the life of President Mandela. I will yield now 2.5 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland, Chris Van Hollen, who's done a lot of work in this House today. Please.
Thank you, and I want to thank my friend Mr. Fattah and my friend Ms. Fudge and the entire CBC for organizing this time to honor the life of Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela, a man who stood up so bravely to injustice, and the power of his beautiful example inspired people around the world, stirred our hearts and stirred our conscience. It was Nelson Mandela and the injustice of apartheid that first moved me to political activism. At the time, I was a student at Swarthmore College in your state of Pennsylvania, and I joined the Swarthmore Anti-Apartheid Committee to urge and petition Swarthmore College to divest from South Africa. And young people at colleges around the country were moved to action. And I watched there, as members of the Congressional Black Caucus here in the United States Congress, work to make sure that the United States stood up to the meaning that is in our founding creed, that all people will be created equal. People like Congressman Gray and others, and members around the world who are today members of the CBC standing up. And then in 1985, I had the privilege of going to work as one of the foreign policy advisors to a great Maryland senator by the name of Mac Mathias, who served on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and was one of the sponsors of the legislation to impose economic sanctions against South Africa because of the evil of apartheid. It was Senator Mathias, Senator Kennedy, Senator Lugar, the Republican chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, working in the Senate along with the CBC in the House of Representatives and others, who said the United States cannot stand by while the evil of apartheid is in place. We must answer the call of Nelson Mandela. And certainly my proudest moment as a staff member to Senator Mathias those days on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee was first when the United States Congress passed that legislation, and then on a bipartisan basis overrode the veto of then President Reagan, showing how the democratic process in this country would work to stand up for justice. And as we confront issues here at home and around the world, we would do well by remembering the example of Nelson Mandela as we confront other issues of justice and peaceful reconciliation. I thank you, Mr. Fattah, for the
I thank the gentleman. And can I inquire about how much time we have left?
The gentleman has 5 minutes remaining.
Okay, I'm going to split this evenly. I'm going to recognize for 2.5 minutes a gentleman from the great state of Georgia. And to this list of Republicans who supported this effort, let me add the name of former Speaker Newt Gingrich, who supported the divestiture effort here in the House. And we want to appropriately recognize his contribution since he's from the great state of Georgia, as we recognize Congressman Johnson.
I thank you, Mr. Fattah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise today to join my distinguished colleagues in a tribute to the life of President Nelson Mandela. I do so with a heavy heart. The people of South Africa and the world at large have lost a great human being and one of the finest leaders ever known. Although President Nelson Mandela has passed, his legacy and his vision remain vital, and they will remain with us. Madiba taught us how to live and also how to die. He inspired hope in the people of South Africa. He set an example of leadership we would all do well to follow. He showed the world that an impassioned pursuit of justice could win over complacency and corruption. I'll always remember Nelson Mandela as a man and a movement. In 1990, not long after Mr. Mandela's release from jail, I attended a speech he gave at Bobby Dodd Stadium in Atlanta, Georgia. Seeing this icon in the flesh and hearing his calm voice taught me something about the nature of a true revolutionary, that they are very real people. Nelson Mandela was a real person who personally faced oppression. Facing that reality made his legend all the more inspiring to me. True progress is not beyond our reach. It is not a product of wishful thinking or serendipity. Radical change comes from determination with integrity. His peaceful presence underscored the intensity of his resolve. He bravely sought to change the seemingly unshakable status quo. The consequences of his actions were severe to him, but they did not break him. He showed the world that no amount of brutality could overpower the will of people determined to be free. Nelson Mandela worked tirelessly to channel the righteous anger of the oppressed into a positive revolutionary change. And what impressed me most about Nelson Mandela was his humble spirit of forgiveness and love towards those who persecuted him. Neither angry nor vindictive, and with great courage and dignity, he endured 27 years in prison, sacrificing his liberty for the sake of all South Africans. Ultimately, he lived a life of triumph over evil and adversity, leaving the world a better place for his journey amongst us. On behalf of the people of Georgia's 4th Congressional District, my wife and myself, I celebrate his life and will work in pursuit of his vision, and the spirit of his life will remain in my heart for so long as I shall live.
Well, I thank the gentleman.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, as I conclude this special order, may I seek unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material relative to the subject of this special order. And let me say in closing that I'd like the House to focus on the transformation of this man who moved from a prison cell to a president of a nation, whose circumstance in 27 years, his picture or his name could not be spoken, but became a world figure. He could not have a visitor, more than one, for 30 minutes in a 6-month period, but yet hundreds of thousands gather to memorialize him. Delegations from almost 100 countries come to his funeral and homegoing celebration. This is a man who traveled a great distance over these 95 years, and he had the willingness to fight against oppression and a willingness to reconcile with his oppressors in a way in which all could live in harmony. He sets a great example for the world, and I thank the House for taking this time to honor his life and legacy. Thank you, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2013, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gomert, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader. I didn't see him walk in.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, tonight, one of the things we did was take up a National Defense Authorization Act bill, and it was to extend the power of the President. There were some good things in it. I applaud the inclusion of a conscience exception that would allow members of the military to do as members of the military have done throughout our history, be able, for example, to have a Bible on a desk, things that now have begun to be result in persecution and actually knocks against the military that were things that our greatest commander in the history of our country, George Washington, felt were noble things. This administration, under its watch, have now begun to be result in persecution. So when you go back to the bill, the authorization of use of military force that was passed on September 18th, 2001, when the United States did not even know who had attacked us, it is incredible. And I don't fault the legislature, the Congress, the House, and the Senate at the time. Americans were scared. Churches, synagogues, they were packed all over America. I've never seen anything like it in my lifetime, the way people especially flocked to churches and were praying fervently. And after there was not another attack within 90 days, it was as if Americans began to say, never mind God, we don't have to worry about that because we hadn't been attacked again. But this, the NDAA basically amends or is added to the authorization for use of military force against September 11th terrorists. That's the name of it. And it says in Section 2A, the President is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons in order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States by such nations, organizations, or persons. And then it sets out war powers resolution requirements, democratic government to replace that. Well, I'm sorry. It says, consistent with Section 8A1 of the War Powers Resolution, Congress declares this section is intended to constitute specific statutory authorization within the meaning of Section 5B of the War Powers Resolution, 50 U.S.C. 1544B. So it goes on, and it's more extensive, and as I say, the NDAA actually modifies and extends things, but when that was passed, we didn't even know who had attacked us. I obviously was not here in Congress at the time, but we were afraid and concerned. We didn't know what was going to hit next. But it perhaps, in retrospect, was a granting of more powers than should have been granted by the Congress because it was subject to being abused. Fortunately, I don't consider that to be having been abused by President Bush. Some blame him for Iraq. I wasn't here at the time, but I can't help but wonder when people supported the numerous efforts, successful efforts by President Bush at the United Nations, building a big coalition of countries to support our efforts to curtail Iraq's military efforts, that they were not allowing UN inspectors to come check on. Every indication, I don't blame the Democrats that voted for the authorization to go into Iraq. I don't blame the Republicans because Saddam Hussein gave every indication to the people that were in Congress at the time and to the President that he was up to no good. And that was a long time ago. And now we find that the President is using forces that or authorities that were granted, and this administration is using authority that was granted to do things like help rebels that we knew at the time in Libya had al-Qaeda infused within them. We just didn't know how extensive, and many of us pointed that out. And now, this fall, we see that this administration has sent hundreds of tons of weapons to the Syrian rebels. And we find out that the Syrian rebels that are fighting a cruel dictator named Assad, they're doing more, engaging in more brutality, particularly against Christians. In the original roots where Christianity was born, these are areas where the Apostle Paul established churches. A city where it's the only city in the world that still speaks the original Aramaic that Jesus was believed to have spoken. So this is an amazing place. This isn't just some trivial area where Christians, a few, happen to be. This is right to the very founding of the Christian church, that so many people came to America to have the freedom to worship without persecution, and fled Europe, fled other places so that they could worship in a Christian church without persecution. And now this administration is using incredible powers that were bestowed on the president by Congress to help the wrong people. And I go back to a visit to the Middle East earlier this fall when allies basically were saying, we do not understand what you're doing. Do you not understand the Muslim Brotherhood was really, I mean, that's who supports radical Islam. And it was the radical Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood, who supported the 9/11 attacks. It was Muslim Brotherhood that basically supported the training and all the efforts the Taliban was doing. It's the Muslim Brotherhood that was engaged in trying to take down Gaddafi, which without American help, they may not have done. It's the Muslim Brotherhood that took control in Egypt and was persecuting Christians, as the Coptic Christian Pope, the Egyptian Pope, verified himself in meetings with him this fall. So they say, and now in Syria, you're backing the people that are at war with you? We don't understand. So since it appears that we have gone from being at war with, as President Bush talked about, anyone who has supported the terrorists, you're either with us or you're with them, and now we've gone to not only not being at war with those who are at war with us, we've gone to helping them. And as a Christian, to know that votes that we've taken in Congress have helped enable this administration to provide weapons of war to people who are brutalizing, raping, killing. Seen reports of the beheadings of Christians in Syria. Though I greatly appreciate some of the things that were included in the NDAA, and in the past I've even helped work on bipartisan agreements, bicameral with the Senate and the House, worked on an effort to rein in the president's authority to just indefinitely detain American citizens, and I think we had a great solution that we had worked together to get inserted. So I don't believe that the president can do that any longer with the language now being used. I still can't continue to support what we're doing, and I hope that we will have a bipartisan effort in the new year to actually end the authorization for use of military force against September 11th terrorists, now that we seem to be helping those who are associated with the radical Islamist terrorists instead of being at war with them. Mr. Speaker, it is an honor to stand here and congratulate the National Industries for the Blind, that's the NIB, on their 75th anniversary and the great work they do for Texas' 1st Congressional District. NIB's mission is to, quote, enhance opportunities for economic and personal independence of persons who are blind, primarily through creating, sustaining, and improving employment, unquote. Unfortunately, 70% of working-age Americans who are blind are unemployed. However, the NIB is trying to reverse those upsetting trends by providing more employment opportunities for people who are blind through their more than 250 locations across the United States. Horizon Industries, which is a division of the East Texas Lighthouse for the Blind, is located in Tyler, Texas, and currently employs 70 blind and visually impaired individuals. When I have visited Horizon Industries, East Texas Lighthouse for the Blind, I am overwhelmed with amazement and appreciation for the dedication, the ability, the desire, and the outright help that these visually impaired American wonders are working with. Horizon, one of their jobs, they convert paper products into industrial cleaning cloths for the General Services Administration and its customers. These incredible employees have also manufactured 35,661 miles of parachute cord for the Department of Defense, much of which was shipped directly to our troops who were deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan. Horizon Industries has empowered blind Americans through employment since 1976. These marvelous friends, whose visual impairment has heightened their other senses to an amazing extent, are dedicated. They love this country. They want to help this country, and are a blessing and an asset to their community, to East Texas, to Texas, and this country. May God continue to bless these wonderful, lovable, dedicated Americans as they continue to bless America. To address the Affordable Care Act, as it was improperly and inaccurately labeled, there's an article from Ben Shapiro at Breitbart today that said on Friday, PolitiFact bowed to the inevitable and named President Obama's, quote, "If you like your health care plan, you can keep it," unquote, statement its lie of the year. That came after PolitiFact labeled that statement, quote, "half-true," unquote, in June of 2012, and then defended its half-true rating in October of 2013. Now PolitiFact said it was a catchy political pitch and a chance to calm nerves about his dramatic and complicated plan to bring historic change to America's health insurance system. But the promise was impossible to keep. Of course, there's more to the story than that. The promise was a lie when it was made, given that they knew at the time it had said that insurance plans could be or would be canceled, but PolitiFact, even in naming the statement Lie of the Year, soft-pedaled that. He fought back against, talking about the president, he fought back against inaccurate attacks with his own oversimplifications, which he repeated even as it became clear his promise was too sweeping. So even PolitiFact, doing all they could to defend something that ended up absolutely not being true, they finally had to come around and actually admit, when the whole country, basically most of the country, could see the truth, even PolitiFact, had to finally get around to being factual. Here's another story from John Nolte, Breitbart 12 December today. Said during Thursday's White House press briefing, the press corps erupted in protests over the Obama administration's lack of transparency and media access. The press corps seemed to be in complete agreement that the Obama White House has been less transparent than the Bush White House. Quite a condemnation for the self-described, quote, most transparent administration in history. Now, I've also noted in the news today statements that from some of our leaders in our Republican Party here in the House that immigration will be a top priority for 2014. I would not have a problem with immigration being a top priority in 2014 if the administration would first enforce the laws that are in effect regarding this nation's security and its immigration laws. We had a hearing today and in Judiciary, heard testimony about the administration through its Customs and Immigration Office and its Immigration or ICE office that actually they're not complying with the law. The law says if somebody claims asylum, then they're detained until such time that they have the matter ultimately adjudicated. And we learned that actually about 75% of those claiming asylum, which has grown multiples of times from where they were in 2008 when President Bush left. Dramatic increase in numbers of people coming across our southern border and claiming asylum, and apparently this administration is releasing about 75% of them, and was quite sad to hear testimony that even though they're making policy that these individuals, deputy directors, could not give us the exact numbers of how many people they were releasing, how many people reported back for their hearings, and so that was quite a bit discouraging. So when you know that there have been so many misstatements that have turned out by this administration that turned out to be far less than accurate or true, then I do not know why Republicans, Democrats would want to take up immigration, which just the discussion about legal status, amnesty, anything of the sort, it creates a massive magnet drawing people across our borders illegally, as we've heard testimony repeatedly, statements repeatedly from our ICE agents, our Immigration and Customs Enforcement people. They say it increases dramatically every time we start talking about legal status and amnesty, and we see huge numbers of people, numbers that we get about the people dying coming across deserts, not having adequate water and food to get across. Why would we do something to create a magnet until we have a secure border? There are a lot of things that need to be reformed, but for those who continue to say, oh yeah, but we'll have real security in the next bill, look, there's money that this administration has, there's manpower this administration has, there is the ability this administration has to secure our border. What it does not have is the will. And if it turned out the administration were really and truly serious about securing our border, that could be confirmed by the border states, then you would see me, along with most of the people I know, willing to sit down and immediately work out an immigration reform package. But to debate it in committee and on the floor, to talk about it, to make speeches before the border is secure, I'm afraid makes us complicit in drawing people across deserts that will not make it and will die in the desert, because we started talking about promises, dangling shiny objects to draw people to us when we had not put proper protection in place to make sure that innocent people did not die trying to get here. For those who say we need to vastly broaden the number of visas, there are some areas that I'm in favor of increasing visas. There are a lot of things we can talk about, but it does not serve those who we will draw across deserts who won't make it. Doesn't serve them any good purpose until the administration secures the border. So with all the wonderful talk about triggers and, oh, but we're going to finally secure the border, yeah, well, President Reagan got fooled on that and regretted it. And I just think it will be a terrible mistake to do anything other than take up a resolution. I filed one basically saying that until the administration secures our borders as confirmed by the border states, not Homeland Security, which we have trouble getting straight answers out of, but as confirmed by the border states, who are important, critical stakeholders in the immigration and secure border issue. When they confirm the borders are secure, then we immediately move into dealing with immigration reform. To do otherwise is a mistake that will do great damage to people that we draw in, unfortunately, to their great damage and possible demise, and it will do great damage to this country. Let's get the immigration, set it on hold, not take anything up until the President is committed and does actually secure the border. Then we get something worked out, and it won't be a difficult issue at all. But for those that say, oh, I think we can trust Homeland Security, or we can trust groups in Washington, or we can trust Homeland Security, sure, we can trust this administration. No, they say that once we give them everything they want in an immigration bill, then they really and truly will start securing the border to the extent that the law requires. And I'm sure I look stupid to some, but I say that's a massive mistake. Follow the law. If you won't enforce and follow and execute the law faithfully now, in accordance with the oath that was taken at the beginning of office, then why should we think things will change after you've gotten everything you want and there is no more incentive to follow the law? Well, and we get back to the promises made about the so-called Affordable Care Act. Here's an article from the Wall Street Journal today. It says, Obamacare raised the cost of your kids' braces. And again, I know the Wall Street Journal, those of us that have used the term Obamacare, we don't mean anything any more derogatory than the President when he called Massachusetts health care Romney Care. I know he didn't mean anything derogatory about it. It was just a way to identify Massachusetts health care. The President didn't mean anything derogatory when he says Romney Care. People that use Obamacare, including the President, don't mean anything derogatory, but it certainly identifies for people more than the Affordable Care Act does, as we've seen man-on-the-street interviews on television when people don't know that the Affordable Care Act and Obamacare are actually the same thing. But this article points out, here's something your orthodontist is not smiling about. A new tax rule raised the cost of braces this year. Thanks to a change from the Affordable Care Act that places an annual $2,500 contribution cap on flexible spending accounts, which let workers set aside pre-tax dollars to cover medical expenses, some consumers may be spending more on braces, expensive eyewear, or other medical supplies they would typically buy with the accounts. Before the new rule, there was no official cap on how much taxpayers could stash into the account, though many companies typically set their own limits of $5,000. For a person in the 25% tax bracket, the cap cuts the maximum tax break in half of $625 to $625 from $1,250. And then it goes on to explain how these increased the cost of the braces and orthodontic care. Another issue here, this article from the Wall Street Journal as well, dated December 11, says, juking the Obamacare stats, says most of Washington seems to have bought the White House claim that the 36 federal exchanges are finally working, and glory, glory, hallelujah. But if that's really true, then what explains the ongoing secrecy and evasion? We have had so much trouble getting answers, specific, direct answers about people who have actually purchased insurance through the exchange. Now, Health and Human Services, HHS, if they don't have these numbers, if they can't even tell us the number of people that have actually purchased insurance, then how, in heaven's name, will they ever be able to tell people whether or not they're actually covered and how extensively they're covered and whether or not they're going to take care of expenses? I mean, the fact that they can't come in here and give us specific information on who signed up, how many have signed up for this, that, or the other, is a terrible harbinger for just how bad and disastrous this health care bill is. And as we have continued to have a number of hearings where we get nothing but obfuscation when specific facts are requested from the administration, we know that somebody has this information in this administration, and it brought to mind the legal doctrine called spoliation. Now, in our American courts, in every state and federal court, we have very strict laws about the admittance of hearsay into evidence before a jury, because our rules are there to protect the finder of fact, the jury, from hearing evidence which does not have really enough credibility to it. And hearsay has to be a specific exception or it's not allowed. It must be direct evidence, otherwise it's not allowed, with very tight exceptions. One exception in most jurisdictions, as we have in Texas, it's called spoliation. The doctrine is this, in essence: if one party in court has control of evidence that would be admissible toward proving or disproving a fact, and that party does not, will not, or say they cannot produce that evidence to prove or disprove a fact, in that case, the judge, as I used to be, could turn to the jury and instruct the jury that even though this is not direct evidence, because of our justice system and the effort to achieve justice in America better than any court system in history, we can direct the jury under the doctrine of spoliation that this party had evidence in their possession that they have either refused to produce, cannot produce, or will not produce. Since this party has possession or had possession of that evidence, then, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you may consider the fact that they're not producing that evidence as evidence itself that, if produced, that evidence would disprove what they're claiming. Let's call the doctrine, in essence, the doctrine of spoliation. So that's the doctrine, the evidentiary doctrine that came to my mind as we've continued to have hearings and the Obama administration refuses or fails and refuses to produce specific information about sign-ups to Obamacare. So if we were in a court of law, it certainly appears that that instruction might be appropriate. Ladies and gentlemen of America, the administration has evidence in its possession that it either cannot, will not, or refuses to produce. Therefore, Americans, ladies and gentlemen of America, you may consider as evidence the fact that they will not produce that information as evidence that it does not support what they claim. Basically, that's what we've got here. They're refusing to produce evidence, information about Obamacare, so I think the American people would be justified, I think a jury in my court would be justified in presuming that a legal presumption that their failure to produce this evidence is evidence that their claims are not supported by the evidence they refuse to produce. Here's an article from the Weekly Standard, December 11th, entitled "Sexiest Man Alive Brought In to Boost Obamacare Enrollment." I don't really know who Adam Levine is. Probably my daughters do, but anyway, he was apparently designated as such by People magazine, but apparently he's been enlisted, according to Bloomberg, as having been hired by this administration to give credibility to Obamacare. To me, again, that seems like if you have to hire some sexy guy to come in and promote, tell people, promote Obamacare as being so wonderful and great, then it's a pretty clear indication that as people look into Obamacare personally, that they don't like what they see, and that's what we're hearing from most constituents. Thankfully, there are a few people that have benefited from Obamacare, but the people we're hearing from, the vast majority, have been hurt, not helped. Here again, another article from the Washington Examiner, Brian Hughes, from today, actually 5:08 p.m. today, says HHS, Health and Human Services, extends more Obamacare deadlines. And it goes on to talk about that the Obama administration announced today that they would take steps to push back an already delayed deadline, help those struggling to obtain health coverage on January 1st, and extend a federal insurance program for those with pre-existing conditions. And it goes on to talk about, I mean, they keep extending deadlines, and if Harry Reid and Senate Democrats had not been so dead set on shutting down the government on October 1st, as they did, if they had been at least willing to forego their desire to shut down the government and hope Republicans got blamed, which they knew the mainstream would do, because the mainstream media would not actually look at the facts, that the House was compromising repeatedly and the Senate was saying our way or the highway, basically by their actions making clear they wanted a shutdown. Well, they got the shutdown, and now, in retrospect, there's got to be people, Democrats in the Senate, that are going, you know what, since we have to keep extending these deadlines, you know, we American people are going to figure out we could have avoided that whole shutdown if Democrats had been even remotely reasonable in the Senate and said, okay, let's go ahead and postpone this for a year because it's not going well. Well, they wanted a shutdown. They got a shutdown as Senate Democrats wanted, and now there's got to be some buyer's remorse. They created the shutdown when they should have taken one of our various compromise offers and at least suspended the individual mandate the way the president illegally did for businesses. And I want to touch on another thing quickly here. Iran is, as Israel has said repeatedly, an existential threat, a threat to the very existence of Israel. If they get nuclear weapons, they want to attack Israel first as the little Satan. They want to attack America next. And we've had Wendy Sherman, who is the lead negotiator for the Obama administration, come up and brief members of Congress. I wasn't there because I'd read about her policy leadership in working out the deal with North Korea under the Clinton administration, which provided them nuclear power plants, fuel, got them up and going, and also agreed not to inspect their nuclear facilities, which gave North Korea time to develop nuclear weapons. And in order to get us to give them nuclear power plants and all that they needed to make nuclear weapons, basically most of what they needed, all they had to do was promise they wouldn't pursue nuclear weapons. Oh, they got to be thinking, these Americans are the most stupid people in the world. Sure, you want us to tell you we won't pursue nuclear weapons? We won't pursue them. Now give us what we need to make nuclear weapons, and we'll make nuclear weapons. And here we got some of the same people involved with the Obama administration want to do the same type of thing with Iran. The trouble is this time it really is a threat to the United States. It's a threat to Israel, and we have betrayed our ally, unfortunately, in Israel. But anyway, here's the people in whom the Clinton administration and numerous people now in the Obama administration have such faith in. This article today, 5:07 p.m., North Korea state media says uncle of Kim Jong-un was executed. Oh, these are great people. These are people that we shouldn't have trusted, but the Clinton administration did, and Wendy Sherman did back in the 90s. She continued to persist, oh, we can trust these guys, even in her op-ed in 2001. And you couldn't trust them. And people that knew these people knew you couldn't trust the leadership. You could trust the North Koreans. You can't trust their leadership. You can trust the Iranians, but you can't trust their leadership. Another article, National Review Online, entitled Nuclear Gangbangers, and it goes ahead and points out that an observant Iran appreciates 3 laws of current nuclear gangbanging. Number 1, nuclear weapons earn a reputation. Number 2, the more loco a nuclear nation sounds, the more likely it is that civilized states will fear that it is not subject to nuclear deterrence, and so the more likely they will pay bribes for it to behave. Gangbangers always claim they have nothing to lose. Their more responsible intended targets have everything to lose. Number 3, as of yet, there are no 100% effective nuclear defense systems that can guarantee non-nuclear powers absolute safety from a sudden attack. The nuclear gangbanger, not the global police, currently has the upper hand. And this administration is turning a blind eye to the deceit and the lies and the nuclear development in Iran to our detriment and the detriment of our dear friend.
20 minutes, I believe, remaining.
Thank you.
Mr. Gohmert.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. In the remaining time, since this